In Essential Task 8.1, we are going to begin talking about biological psychology. There are quite a few different topics that fall under the category of biological psychology. Everything from the neuron to the brain to sleeping, drugs, neurotransmitters, and quite a few in between. We will first begin by talking about what's called the neuron. In Essential Task 8.1, talk about the basic parts of the neuron and then 4 specific types of neurons. You will notice next to the H in the Essential Task text, I have the word diagram. I am asking you for one half of the concept map to draw a diagram that looks something like this. This exact document is pictured and included in Google Classroom, but when I look for the neuron portion of your concept map, I am going to anticipate seeing a concept map that looks identical to this. As you will see, this concept map is broken up into 2 sections. 4 boxes over here on the left that will denote 4 types of neurons, and then the structure of the neuron. This portion here, the structure of the neuron, looks identical to what I have on this piece of paper. So many students ultimately submit 2 pieces of paper for this concept map, a single sheet of paper with the 4 boxes under types of neurons, and then their diagram, which denotes the structure of an individual neuron. So I'll return now to the task text. The expectation is typically to put the yellow portion on the piece of paper where you're about to put the 4 types of neurons: motor neurons, sensory neurons, interneurons, and mirror neurons. You do not need to copy down the yellow portion of the text on the diagram. So as you see here in my example, I do not have the text of the task. We will begin all the way on the left and denote these 4 boxes from left to right under types of neurons. This unit is one of those units where essential tasks are going to build on one another. So each individual essential task in and of itself might not seem super clear. Each individual vocab word in isolation might not also seem super clear, but I promise once we get through really the first 3 essential tasks, we'll be able to look big picture and put all of these things together. Nevertheless, we need to talk about the 4 primary types of neurons in your body. The first of which is called sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are occasionally called afferent neurons, and this is an important AKA to write down. I'd say over the course of the past 5+ years, the College Board has typically used sensory neurons. That's the name that I also typically use, but there is a synonym that is worth writing down, and there's also a really easy mnemonic to connect the synonym to the primary term sensory neuron, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. But sensory neurons are neurons in our body that are responsible for taking incoming sensory information at our sensory receptor cells and sending that information towards our brain and spinal cord for processing. And it's more than just one sense. Typically, we often think about this as the sense of touch, but it is also our other senses. So, for example, when I touch this pen, in my finger right now are sensory receptor cells, specifically in my fingers that are touching the pen. As I'm pressing down and applying pressure to this pen, the sensory neurons in my fingertips are responsible for sending my brain and spinal cord information about what it is that I'm touching. If I then go and pick up my phone, well, the tactile touch texture of my phone is a little bit different. It weighs a little bit different. It feels a little bit different relative to just a plastic pen. Well, my sensory receptors in my fingers right now are in the process of alerting my brain and spinal cord about the sensory information about what it is that I'm touching. We also have receptor cells, for example, in our retina, which is inside of our eye, a topic we'll get to in a later unit, which is inputting light. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later unit, but those sensory neurons, for example, in our eyes, specifically in our retina, are responsible for also sending information to the brain pertaining to the sensory information that we are experiencing. Essentially, sensory neurons are the first step in what will ultimately be a 3-step process related to our interactions with the world. Interneurons are neurons that are responsible for facilitating communication between sensory neurons and motor neurons. We'll see interneurons primarily in the spinal cord and brain. As we'll see as we talk later in an essential task regarding reflexes, when we exhibit a spinal reflex, many of which you've actually probably had tested at the doctor's office, but there are others too that you don't necessarily test at the doctor's office. A very common one that the College Board will cite is if you were to touch a scalding hot plate, your arm is going to immediately retract the moment it touches that hot object. That movement of your arm protruding backwards the second you touch that hot object is an example of your interneurons working. Your interneurons are responsible for communication between the brain and spinal cord, but are also responsible for facilitating reflexes produced by the spinal cord. When you touch that hot object, the sensory neurons in your fingertips send that message first to the spinal cord. The spinal cord, acknowledging that it is a hot object, that it is painful, and that it is dangerous, can actually retract your arm prior to sending the message up to the brain. Most, if not all, of our other motor movements are facilitated by our brain, at least voluntary motor movements. We'll talk about involuntary ones at a later point. But typically, moving your hand back is a voluntary action. Well, that's actually not the case with our reflexes. When we touch that really hot object, our interneurons can actually facilitate that just in and of themselves without having to get input from the brain. So when you touch something really hot, it's not like your brain has to sit there and ponder, should I move my hand? Nope, your interneurons are actually already going to trigger that spinal reflex. Beyond that interaction with reflexes, which we'll actually talk more about when we get to the spinal cord, your interneurons are responsible for acting sort of as an intermediary between sensory input, what it is that you're touching, the way it feels, its weight, the pressure, whether it's hot or cold, and what your motor neurons would subsequently do. Your motor neurons, which is the third within the sequence of four, are responsible for sending messages from the brain to the parts of your body that trigger motor movement. In this course, motor is a reference to movement, so whether it's motor neurons, motor skills, motor movements, we're talking about running and kicking and lifting your arm up. Well, motor neurons are neurons that are activated as a result of messages sent from your brain. And what we see here is if you choose to get up and walk around, you need to send motor messages from your brain to the muscles in your arms and legs in order to facilitate that movement. So as easy it is as picking up this pen, I just had motor neurons triggered the muscles in my arm and in my fingers in order to grasp and hold this. It was a voluntary motor movement facilitated by my motor neurons. If you're driving a car and need to take a left turn, that ability to turn the wheel to the left and perform the physical movements necessary to do so is facilitated by your motor neurons. Similar to sensory neurons, there is a synonym here that I would like you to copy down. These can sometimes be called efferent neurons. So when we sort of zoom back out and look at these three together before we proceed to the last one, if you were to touch a pen, the sensory information about what it is that you are touching is now being sent to the spinal cord and up to the brain. It is there in the brain where the processing regarding the texture and the characteristics of the pen is actually processed. We'll talk more about that later. But if I were now voluntarily going to drop the pen, the motor neurons in my body are going to be activated from messages in my brain, and now I've just dropped the pen. My brain has told the muscles in my hand to let go. The muscles that let go were facilitated by motor neurons. So in many ways, if we zoom in onto this, sensory neurons send the message up to the interneurons into the spinal cord. The spinal cord then facilitates that message up towards the brain. The brain then decides, okay, we now need to get some other movement to occur. So the motor neurons will be sent back out, alerting the brain or alerting the body to, for example, let go of a pen. The mnemonic that I was alluding to a few moments ago is if you take the first letter of sensory, afferent, motor, and efferent in this order, it spells the word same. I think this is a pretty easy mnemonic to connect these synonyms for each of these two terms. Again, the College Board has typically selected sensory and motor, but if you go back far enough, somewhere around 2012, you might see questions that actually use afferent or efferent, and I might occasionally include those. So I think it's important to write down this mnemonic because it's actually a pretty easy one in connecting those terms. We'll now proceed to mirror neurons. This is a relatively new discovery. I'm talking about a discovery in the 1990s. We have evidence to suggest that this is definitely an element of animal behavior, and there's some strong belief that it's also reflected in human behavior, so that's why I've used the word organism. But nevertheless, the idea of mirror neurons is actually quite fascinating, and it's connected to one of the last things we talked about in our behavioral psychology unit. Mirror neurons are supposedly neurons that are active when you're carrying out a behavior, but also when you're observing another person do that same behavior. So, for example, these would be neurons that we could track in your brain that are active when you're shooting basketballs, but also when your coach is shooting a basketball. That there is a connection between neurons that are active when you're doing something and observing it. There is a strong belief that these mirror neurons are the basis biologically for observational learning. That although you yourself might not be the actual person shooting basketballs, the neurons in your brain that would be active while you were playing basketball seem to be active and firing. We'll talk more about that word firing later. But that the neurons in your brain are firing even though you yourself are not in the moment playing. So that ability of watching is actually in some capacities strengthening the behavior from a neurological perspective, because your brain is in many ways acting as if you were actually doing the behavior when you're only observing it. It's the idea that your neurons are mirroring behaviors that you're observing in others. So those are the 4 primary types of neurons. The first 3 are very interconnected to one another. Sensory input is sent to the brain from sensory neurons to your interneurons. The interneurons in the spinal cord send it up to the brain. The brain then decides to produce movements, whether that's walking, running, or picking something up. So the brain then sends messages down to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord facilitates those messages out via motor neurons to the corresponding muscles for movement. So the first 3 are very much interconnected. Mirror neurons are more isolated in and of themselves. They're neurons that you're specifically just going to see in the brain. The next thing to talk about now references the diagram that I was alluding to. We're going to talk about the structure of a single neuron, and I'd like you, again, to copy down a diagram as you see here at the top. And then the expectation is that you're going to have 2 boxes and 2 boxes across 3 columns. The first column labeled dendrite, the second one labeled axon, and the third one labeled terminal button. That is the expectation for this portion of the concept map. What we are going to first do is start all the way on the left and talk about dendrites. When I'm referencing dendrites, I'm referencing the branches or the region that you see here all the way on the left captured by this white bracket. So we'll start all the way here on the left in the top corner, and we'll talk about this column here. Dendrites are the region of a single neuron that on the surface contain what are called the receptor sites. This is the region of the neuron that is activated via messages from other neurons, specifically at the receptor sites. And when a dendrite is activated, so the branches that you see all the way on the left, the dendrites are responsible for beginning the process of alerting the remaining portion of the neuron. So for example, when I pick up this pen, as I was alluding to earlier, the sensory neurons in my fingertips are now being activated, pertaining to the details of this pen, specifically at the dendrites of the receptor neurons. So the second my finger starts to touch the plastic of this pen, the dendrites in the sensory neurons in my fingertips are activated. And that's going to begin the whole process that we're going to talk about between today's essential task and the next one. So the dendrites are basically the portion relative to the diagram all the way on the left that is responsible for receiving information, typically from other neurons, or in this case, it can be about the fine details of the pen, but in most cases, it's from other neurons. To get a little bit more specific, though, not only is it just the dendrites, it's the outer region of the dendrites that's being activated. It's the outer surface. So if you take a look at the left side of the diagram that I asked you to copy, imagine the outer surface. So in the case of my diagram, it's with a black outline. Imagine that black outline being lined with what are called receptor sites. That's the very, very surface of the dendrites. The receptor sites, as we're going to talk about later on, are sensitive to a chemical in your body known as a neurotransmitter. We're going to talk all about neurotransmitters in the upcoming Essential Task 8.2. So we're going to kind of leave neurotransmitters as they are. I promise I will define it and give you a ton of detail about what a neurotransmitter is. But as I alluded to at the beginning of this task, we kind of need to build these first couple tasks and then zoom back out and reflect on everything. So I promise I'll talk a little bit about that. But typically, to activate a dendrite, there needs to be a chemical present known as a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is what stimulates the receptor sites. So the surface of the dendrite, the outer region of the dendrite, the left portion of the diagram that I asked you to copy down, those receptor sites on the surface are sensitive to a chemical in your body known as a neurotransmitter. And these neurotransmitters do everything from regulate mood to make you hungry, to make you alert, to make you tired. We'll talk all about that in a later essential task. Just to kind of zoom in here on the diagram to explain what it is you're looking at. Ignore this here on the left. I promise I'll explain what that means in a later portion. But just looking here on the right, it's labeled dendrite. So I want you to envision this as the outer surface of one of these. Notice these little receptor sites, almost these little indent and concave visuals that you see here. That's what I want you to picture with these receptor sites. They're the outer region of the dendrite. We're now going to move into the middle portion here. So Before we do so, I want to point out, back when you took freshman bio, you probably talked a whole lot about the cell body, the nucleus, the mitochondria. All that stuff is actually still present. We just simply don't talk about in AP Psych. But all of that prior knowledge about the cell, and specifically the cell body or the soma, all of that information still pertains to this. It just isn't related to the actual process of neural communication that we care about. So all that stuff is typically over here. We, however, are going to now bracket off this region here. It almost looks like there's these little yellow olives. We're going to talk about the region of the neuron that I call the axon, or the axon terminal. Technically, and this is going to seem a little unnecessarily confusing, but technically when somebody says axon, they could be referencing the entirety of the neuron that's remaining, this whole region here. I typically like to call the axon this region here to kind of keep it easier, the portion with these little yellow olives. But technically the axon is the remainder of the neuron that you're looking at, or the axon terminal. But nevertheless, this middle region here that we're going to be talking about, referencing the axon or the axon terminal, is responsible for taking messages received at the dendrite and sending that information to the end of the neuron, to what's called the terminal, or what can sometimes be called the terminal buttons. So when a dendrite is activated at its receptor sites, the information that the dendrites are receiving, perhaps about the characteristics of what you are touching, are sent through the neuron to the axon terminal, which is this portion here. This region known as the axon and the axon terminal is responsible for sending the information about what you're touching, like the characteristics and how it feels, out to the outer regions of the neuron. We call these regions here the terminal buttons. We'll define that in just a little bit. That's the fifth box in today's concept map, at least relative to the diagram, the fifth box within the diagram. So we'll talk about what exactly the terminal buttons are in just a moment. So after the dendrites are activated here, specifically at the receptor sites, information about the details of what, in this case, you're touching, though it could be what you're seeing, what you're smelling, etc., that information is sent through the neuron, down the axon, towards the outer region here, called the terminal buttons, which we're going to define and describe in just a moment. You might notice those little yellow olives, they actually have a formal name. They're called the myelin sheath. Not all neurons technically have this, though typically when the College Board elects to include a diagram of a neuron, they typically do include myelin sheath, but technically not all neurons have myelin. Myelin is often the region of the neuron that is cited for the symptoms related to multiple sclerosis. The progressive deterioration of myelin can slow down neural communication within the body, which as a result would have a sort of progressive slowdown of a lot of primary functions. The myelin sheath itself plays the role of making the process that we are about to describe in Essential Task 8.2 quicker. Myelin's number one primary goal is to make the process of neural communication as fast as possible. We'll talk a little bit about the finer details as to why that is the case when we progress into the next essential task. But in many ways, the myelin sheath acts as an insulation across this really narrow axon here. And it makes it so that the process of taking information about, in this case, what you're touching relative to other information, it allows that process to go much, much faster. In neurons that have no myelin or deteriorated myelin are simply slower in the process of communication. You might notice here in the bottom right corner, the myelin sheep. It's a nickname or a mnemonic that I use. You'll notice in class I have a yellow ball with this sheep diagram attached to it with these little lightning bolt ears. I'll talk a little bit more about that mnemonic in class. We'll do a little demo to the best of our ability to exhibit this. But the mnemonic's supposed to be a little silly way of looking at the name myelin sheath and thinking about the name myelin sheep. We will now progress. We'll skip the demo here. It's something you kind of have to see in person. We'll now skip to the final part. We're now going to follow the yellow, or the white brackets all the way on the right and talk about the branches that you see on the right. That region is what we call the terminal buttons. Don't get confused here. The axon terminal versus the terminal buttons. The essential difference here is the axon terminal can reference any remaining part of the neuron. When somebody says terminal buttons, though, they very much mean the very, very end. So the word terminal means the end. So that's one way of denoting the difference between these. The terminal buttons, as I just referenced, is the very end of the neuron, and it's the branches that you see all the way on the right of your diagram. Inside the terminal buttons of a neuron are what we call the synaptic vesicles. They are these little vesicles, and inside of those vesicles, you will find the chemical neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters that I referenced earlier, as we'll talk about in a later essential task, these neurotransmitters do everything from help you remember, to help you move, to make you hungry, to make you want to go to sleep. Well, those chemicals, those vital chemicals in your body, at most times are held within what are called the synaptic vesicles, which are these little pods in the terminal buttons. As we alluded to a moment ago, the synaptic vesicles, and this here is the last box. Don't quite end the video or end your concept map. I need to describe a mnemonic that I referenced a few times, the DAT, Datway mnemonic. Now that you've seen these boxes, it's a super important mnemonic. But as I referenced, synaptic vesicles are in the terminal buttons, little sacs or pods, and inside of them, you will find neurotransmitters. We'll talk all about what exactly those neurotransmitters do in the upcoming essential tasks. But these neurotransmitters hang out in the synaptic vesicles until a message that started at the dendrites and went through the axon reaches the end of the neuron, reaches the terminal or the terminal buttons of a neuron. And when that happens, as you can see here in this diagram, the little blue dots in the synaptic vesicles here, these little blue dots, exit out of the neuron and enter into what's called the synapse, this region here in the diagram. The synapse is a primary topic of an upcoming essential task that we'll talk about in 8.2, so I promise I will explain what this is. But when we do so, we'll put the entire process together. But for now, all we need to know is that at the very end of a neuron, in the terminal buttons, is a region called the synaptic vesicles. They're little sacs, little pods, and inside of them are chemicals known as neurotransmitters, which hang out in those vesicles until stimulated or triggered by messages that began at the dendrite, specifically the receptors of the dendrite, and made it all the way through the neuron to the terminal. As a mnemonic, now that you've seen each of these terms and the sort of primary terms here at the top that I've denoted with a yellow D, A, and T, the way communication works in a neuron is it follows this process or the direction of Datway. Messages in a neuron start at the dendrites, D, go through the axon, A, and end in the terminal, starting with the T. And we'll talk all about that in the next essential task. But essentially, when a neuron is stimulated, it's stimulated at the dendrites, specifically the receptor sites, the surface of the dendrites. That information, what I mean by information, I mean things like literally the details of what you're touching or the direction by which your body wants to move. The information that it is receiving is then sent Datway. Starting in the dendrites, it goes through the axon. The information reaches the end of the neuron quicker if that neuron has myelin sheath. If it doesn't, it takes few split seconds, but it does go faster if there's myelin. It reaches the terminal or the end of the neuron. At the end of the neuron, you will find synaptic vesicles, which contain neurotransmitters. As we'll add to our discussion tomorrow or in the next essential task, when this information reaches the end of the neuron, the neurotransmitters at the end of the neuron are going to be released out of the neuron, and we'll talk in the next essential task about what exactly that means. But that mnemonic Datway is supposed to give you the indication of dendrites, axon, terminal. Dendrites, axon, terminal. It gives you the direction of communication, and it allows you to fill out the diagram with ease.